Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you all. I know I have a challenge having to follow Professor Wood, but let me first start off by thanking all the wonderful folks in the Dean's office for helping put this together. Victoria and Wes and Lizzie and Randy and Benedict and Shannon and Regina and Matt. I couldn't do what I do without the support of a wonderful team. So I'm just going to give you a pretty quick overview about what I view as some of the grand challenges facing our society today. And these challenges are going to have to be resolved by your children. We're going to leave it to the students of today to really help make the world a better place. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I hope to talk to you about today. I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the School of Biological Sciences. And then I will try to convince you why this is such a wonderful time to be a biologist and why people refer to this as the century of biology. And then last, I would like to share with you our foundational vision for the school, which are the three words that you see up on the screen, MindBody World. And the philosophy underlying this is pretty simple, and that is that for most of us, to have a healthy mind, we need to have a healthy body. To have a healthy body, we need to have a healthy world, because life is interconnected. So first, let me start off with a couple brag points. Perhaps you've seen some of these. If in case you have not, it's good to refresh your memories. Perhaps what we're most happy about is that just this year, Money Magazine rated UCI as the #1 college in America, and we knocked Princeton off of its perch. That's really exciting news. And it's the first time ever in the history of these rankings that a public university has achieved the #1 spot. So all of the Anteater family should be very, very proud of that. And you could see some of the other accolades up there, including Forbes magazine rating us as #1 for best value. And the campus is particularly proud of the New York Times ranking as the #1 university doing the most for the American dream. And the idea behind that is that UCI, a critical part of our fabric, is that we believe higher education is a vehicle for all members of our society to increase their social mobility. It's not just about the elite or privileged few having that opportunity to go to college. So hopefully you're as proud of these statistics as all of us here on the faculty are at UCI. Now, I want to give you a little bit of history about the School of Biological Sciences, and a lot of individuals are unaware of how innovative the school was from the time of its founding. And at every university in the world, when biology was being studied at the time UCI was being created, biology departments were based on taxonomy. You had departments of zoology, botany, bacteriology, and when the founding dean of UCI started the School of Biological Sciences, he recognized that that's not the way the departments should be organized, but they should be organized based on levels of analysis. So he created departments at the subcellular, cellular level, at the organismal and systems level, and at the superorganismal level, looking at the environment and ecology. That was so revolutionary that now every university in the world with a biology program organizes it the way it was first done at UCI. So we should be very proud of the fact that we did not try to copy our way to the top, but we tried to be very innovative. So that was the first innovation that the founding dean had. The second was he thought that the study of the brain was so important that it should be based in a biological department and not strictly studied from a psychological point of view. And he created the first academic department in the world devoted to the study of the brain, which happens to be Professor Wood's department and my home department as well, neurobiology and behavior. And that, again, was so innovative, it was established 5 years before the Society for Neuroscience was established, and even before Harvard and other universities had established their neurobiology department. So the study of our brain, which I think we could all agree on, is perhaps the most complex structure in the known universe, was first established here as a discipline at UCI. And again, believe that that's something that we all should be quite proud of. So, what is our mission in the world? And I think Marcelo alluded to this. We want to make discoveries that really transform the world. And one of the most exciting aspects about sending your child to UCI is that they are learning from researchers that are on the front lines creating new knowledge about what the underlying biological processes are. They're not hearing this repeated by someone else that learns it from us, but they get to hear it from individuals that are really on the front line. And we get to share not only what those discoveries are, but more importantly, we get to share that experience of discovery, how you conduct research, how you can critically analyze and critically think about problems with the students. And so it's a wonderful experience and a great way to augment your education, the education of our students. And then lastly, we love in the school to inform the public about how critical biology is in our society today. And if there's anything that you get out of this talk, I hope it's that you realize that biology is more important today, particularly with coronavirus, than at any other time point in our history. So our vision follows nicely with that, and that is we want to create new knowledge so we can solve the grand challenges facing our society. We really want these discoveries to lay the foundation to help improve our health, to protect the environment, and to even develop novel sources of bioenergy. And we believe that our scholarship is going to help countless numbers of people throughout the world, but particularly here, use it to spark economic development in California and in the country, very much akin to what Professor Wood described in his presentation. So you should all know that the School of Biological Sciences is relatively large. As a single school at UCI, we're roughly the size of a small private college such as Chapman University. You can see we have about 131 Senate faculty. We're very proud of how distinguished our faculty are, and you can see a lot of the accolades are listed up on the screen. And likewise, if you look at the number of students that we have here, we have about 4,000 undergraduates, about another 500 or so PhD and master students. So sometimes a little bit more, sometimes closer to 5,000 students. And again, just to put that in perspective, Chapman has about 6,000 students throughout their entire campus system there. And just in the School of Biological Sciences, we have that many. And so very proud of all the degrees that we offer here at UCI. Now, we're trying to make the educational experience very fun, and one of the things that I was really adamant about when I became dean was I wanted to make sure that the time that I said hello to the students wasn't also on the same day when I said goodbye to them, which was on commencement. And so we tried to develop a lot to improve the culture, and I think Professor Wood alluded to a lot of this earlier. And one of the functions that we created is this pretty fun thing called Donuts with the Dean, in which we hosted outside the dean's office on the 5th floor. And a lot of faculty and VIP guests are invited. Some will give a little presentation. And it provides the students with a great opportunity to mingle and learn from the faculty, be able to go up to them and say, what was the secret to your success? How can I succeed in the world today? So I would urge you to really get your students, your children, to take advantage of this wonderful program. Unfortunately, space is very limited for it, and it books up very quickly. We generally do them the first week of the quarter because that's when the students want. And in case those of you don't eat donuts, we do have a lot of healthy food there besides the donuts. Now, along these lines, when I became dean, one of the first things I wanted to do was to build our own little coffee shop on the Biosci quadrangle. Everyone thinks that I had the Starbucks built because I have this massive caffeine addiction. I'm probably one of the only Italians in the world that really doesn't drink coffee, but I thought it was critical for us to have our own space where students could accidentally bump into the faculty. And I think that's where the magic happens. And it turns out that this Starbucks has been so much more successful and so much more crowded than we anticipated. But I would really urge you to help your child break out of their shell and not be shy, and go up to the faculty and ask them questions about how they can be more successful. And again, what the secret to their success was. That's why we're here. We're here to help your students, and you have to help us help them. So there are other activities that we do along these lines. So for example, we have a mentorship program where we bring pillars of the communities, the most successful alumni and other partners to come in and serve as coaches and guides and to help motivate our students, advise them, and give them role models. I think we could all agree that the world is a lot more complex, certainly, and we have a lot more choices than when I was an undergraduate. And students need that advice. Now, I have to say, I was informed once by a very famous neuropathologist, and he gave me a piece of advice, and he said, Frank, essentially the only people that you could effectively mentor are the ones that don't need it. And I think there's some truth to that, but all of us can benefit from mentoring. Now, one of the things that you'll be hearing a lot about over this weekend is that the campus is about to embark on this very ambitious campaign, this $2 billion philanthropic campaign called Brilliant Future. Now, I think it's critical that you understand why we launched this campaign. And we launch it so that we could catapult UCI to even higher levels of greatness and achievement. If we do nothing, we will remain at the status quo. And the value of everyone's degree from UCI is dependent upon us maintaining a very strong trajectory. And so in the School of Biological Sciences, our priorities are about empowering team science, making sure that we nurture the emerging scientists, funding audacious lines of inquiry, and like I just presented with the Starbucks and with the Donuts with the Dean, doing everything that we can to enhance the student experience. At the end of the day, when individuals graduate from UCI, I want them to not only know as much about biology, but I want them to say that they loved their time as a biology major here at UCI. I want them to think of us as their second home, away from home, and to feel very comfortable being here. So, along those lines, we have a lot of programs to ensure that the students are as successful as possible. One of them is a program called EASE, which stands for Enhanced Academic Success Experience. And this is a program designed specifically for first-year students. It's the idea of putting them into relatively small cohorts of about 30 individuals. And it's been shown and demonstrated that students learn better and they form stronger relationships when you put them in these peer groups. We have some evidence that it helps improve their grade point averages in the first year, but more importantly, they learn some of the skills that will allow them to do better in the future. And it creates this sense of belonging. We recognize that when you come to a school like UCI, where there are about 30,000 plus students, it's very large. The School of Biological Sciences has about 1,200 or so students per class, it's easy to get lost. And these programs are designed to make sure that the student does not get lost and they feel that they belong. So it's trying to really empower them so that they could achieve what their aspirational goals are. And we want to make sure that everyone feels like they can belong. And so this is one of the signature programs in the School of Biological Sciences. We're very proud of the fact that the school has partnered with the National Institutes of Health to create this minority science program to give underrepresented minorities the possibility to explore research and to explore whether or not they want to pursue that as a career. I happen to be an immigrant. Both my parents were immigrants, and immigrants generally want their kids to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. You know, you don't think of pursuing a career in academia, and certainly that was the situation for me. And I had the opportunity to work during a paid summer internship. I was supposed to clean rat cages all summer long. It turns out it only took about 3 days to clean them all. And so since I was being paid, some of the professors said, we want you to conduct some research, and I fell in love with research, much to the disappointment of my mother that I didn't go to medical school. But for me, it was the right career path. And the students, not only do they get to learn how to do research, they get to participate in national conferences. Many of them win wonderful awards. The success rate in graduating with a bachelor's degree is almost 100%, and a majority of them go on to pursue a doctorate degree. So we're very proud of this particular program. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is the century of biology, and hopefully everyone knows that that's Steve Jobs there, the creator of Apple. And so when Steve Jobs speaks, everyone listens. And he, one of my favorite quotes that he said, of course, is that I think the biggest innovation of the 21st century will be at the intersection of biology and technology. A new era is beginning. And part of the reason that we're entering into this wonderful era for biology is because of all the devices that we now wear that can keep track of our physiological responses when we're doing certain things. And that leads to the promise of better health and increased longevity. But of course, with that comes some challenges as well. Now, I'm really enamored with this author. He's an Israeli philosopher. His name's Yuval Noah Harari, and he wrote 3 outstanding books. I would encourage all of you, if you have time, to read them. They're really fun. The first was entitled Sapiens, a Brief History of Humankind. The second, Homo Deus, and the third, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. They're really good. And if I had to, really summarize some of the points that he makes in his books, he kind of gives an interesting historical perspective of some of the major scourges that have traditionally affected mankind. And he said, throughout history, we have a major issue for us was famine. And he said, in today's society, there's really no reason for us to have issues with food production. And if we do, it's mainly because the government has adopted policies that are not conducive to be in a very food productive society. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly, in the old days, infectious diseases was a major scourge. And today, not so much. Although, ironically, we could see that it could, raise its head any time. And so now the entire world is worried about an infectious agent called the coronavirus. And so it's something that we have to consider. And that's why I think continuing to conduct research in the life sciences is going to be so critical. And the last point he had was that war and violence used to claim a lot of human lives. And so there's some statistics that relate to these challenges, and particularly when you look at deaths. And so as of 2012, which is I think when the last statistics were available, About 120,000 people died throughout the world because of war and violence. About 500,000 people, about 500,000 people died because of crime. Even more so, died at their own hands due to suicide. And then if you look at how many people die as a result of diabetes, we find that it's about 1.5 million individuals. So more people die from diabetes-related illnesses compared to war, crime, or suicide. And so his point is that sugar may be more lethal than some of those other causes of death there. Now, there are other issues throughout history, such as early mortality, particularly in the developed country. That's not so much of a problem. We do know that obesity is a significant problem, particularly in developed countries, and you're 3 times more likely to die from obesity than you are from famine. As a matter of fact, we think that most people are probably going to die from eating too many cheeseburgers as opposed to some infectious disease. But what is really of concern, particularly over the last couple of decades, are these chronic diseases, things that are non-infectious like cancer and heart disease and many age-related ailments that still turn out to consume a significant number of the resources in developed countries. So why is this a problem? Well, if you look at the world population, you can see that essentially every 10 to 12 years, we're adding about 1 billion new people. I mean, the earth doesn't get any bigger when we add more people to it. And yet we still expect enough drinking water, clean air, productive soil to be able to feed all of these individuals. And yet we have to maintain the world in a sustainable fashion. And so this is, I think, a good example where the life sciences come in. Now, this problem, of course, is exacerbated when you look at what's happening to lifespan. And this is a success of modern medicine that you could see that in today's society, the average age that people live to is about well into their 80s. And actually, this year was the first time in several years that the lifespan in the United States did not decline and actually went up. But women, on average, live a little bit longer than men. And you can see that over the next 15 to 20 years, lifespan's going to continue to increase. As a matter of fact, the fastest growing segment of our society are people over the age of 90. And so that creates a lot of challenges for us. And so obviously I'm very biased. I'm a dean of a school of life sciences. I think the most significant challenges that our society are facing are related to life science related issues, such as those that revolve around aging. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. The environment, energy. I mean, when you add a lot of people to the planet, that's a lot of cell phones you got to keep functioning. So you need to come up with energy. And then, of course, food and water. But I think this is where today's students are going to have the impact, because the answer to these challenges are going to be solved by today's students. And almost all of these issues will have a biological-based solution to them. Now, age-related diseases, everyone always says that aging is awful except for the alternative. And you could see what happens as you age. Heart disease goes up, diabetes goes up, you're more prone to infectious agents. Cancer is an age-related disease. You become more frail. I turned 55 and I seem to have this floating injury that one time it's on the left side, then it's on the right side, then it's on the top part, then the bottom, the back. It just seems like I'm never clear of this. And the only thing worse is that I said that to one of my friends that I play tennis with. He goes, wait until you get 60, you'll have more than one injury at a time. And then, of course, the granddaddy of them all is Alzheimer's disease, which happens to be the area of my research focus. Now, we want to make sure that you not only live longer, but that you live better. And it's always fun to show these kind of slides, and I'm sure many people know who this individual is. It's, of course, Betty White, who's a famous actress who has been active in Hollywood for 8 decades or so. I mean, it's just an outrageously long period of time. It's also funny to lecture to the undergraduates because they have no idea who she is. But the point is, we want to live longer. We want to be about successful aging. And if you're born after the year 2000, you have a greater than 50% shot of living to your 100th birthday. Okay? And so it's not only about living longer, it's about living better. And recently, Time magazine put this image of this cute little baby on its cover, and the caption was, "This baby could live to be 142 years of age." Now, think about when you get to retire if everyone's going to live to 142 years of age. Do you work until you're 110 years of age, which is essentially double what we do right now? So it creates a lot of interesting issues for us to try and solve. Now, I happen to work on Alzheimer's disease, which is a really grave problem facing our society. And there's this quote by a Spanish filmmaker, and he kind of summarizes what this disease is all about. And he says that life without memory is no life at all, because our memories define our humanity. They are what make us human, and they are the key to the most precious relationships that we have in our lives. And so without them, we're nothing. And yet Alzheimer's is turning out to be a huge problem for our society. Now, one of the questions I get asked more frequently than just about any other one is, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? And it's not unusual for a lot of family members to come up to me and said, "Oh, my loved one had Alzheimer's, didn't have dementia." Well, dementia is a broad umbrella term, the same way that cancer is a broad umbrella term. And just like there are many different types of cancers, there's skin cancer and liver cancer, lung cancer, there are many different types of dementias. It turns out that Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. About 65% of all cases of dementia are due to the Alzheimer's type. So if you have Alzheimer's, you definitely have dementia. But if you have dementia, it doesn't have to be Alzheimer's. There are thousands of different causes of dementia. Here's just some of the most common ones that are age-related that are listed here. Now, if you are a female and you have breast cancer, you don't want a drug that's used to treat prostate cancer, right? That makes sense, right? It's a different tissue type, different mechanism of disease. The same thing is true among the dementias. While they have certain similarities in common, and all dementias share 3 things. So the first requirement is you need to have a problem with your memory. The second requirement is that you need to have a problem in another cognitive domain. And the third requirement to consider someone demented is that problems number 1 and 2 have to be so severe that it interferes with your ability to engage in your occupation or in a social setting. So when I was growing up, one of my neighbors was demented. She would come over to our house, and after dinner, she would sweep up all the crumbs off of the table and then find somebody's handbag to dump the crumbs into. That's not normal social behavior, okay? So without having all 3 of those required, you do not get a diagnosis of dementia. I should also point out that I'm the director of our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here and clinic, and that is perhaps the number 1 reason why people do not want to come to see us, is because if we give them a diagnosis of dementia, we have to report it to the DMV, and people don't want to lose their driver's license. We try to counsel them and their families that if you're demented, you definitely do not want to drive. So why is this a problem? Well, right now, I would argue that this is perhaps the biggest plague facing our society. You could see as of 2020, there are 5.8 million Americans that are impacted by this disease alone. Costs about $290 billion a year, and 1 out of every 5 Medicare dollars goes to care for Alzheimer's patients. To put this another way, every 65 seconds, someone develops dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, in the United States. By 2050, that number will be someone developing the disease every 30 seconds. So every minute, 2 people will develop Alzheimer's. And you could see if the course remains unchanged, it's estimated that in just a couple of decades, we're going to see 14 million Americans that are impacted. The cost to care for these individuals is going to skyrocket. There's no way the government's going to be able to meet its fiduciary responsibilities, and it's for education, defense, and roads, and other infrastructure if we're spending so much money. And by that time, 1 out of every 3 Medicare dollars will go to care for Alzheimer's patients. So there are many risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Turns out that the most significant by far is age, and I'll review some of that later. But likewise, if you have a family history of dementia in your family and Alzheimer's, that increases your risk. If you play football or sustain head injuries, that markedly increases your risk. So for example, football players have, if you play in the National Football League, you have a 19-fold higher shot of developing dementia compared to someone that does not. Now, would you sign a contract if you're 20 years old for $1 million a year, if you know that in 20 years your brain is no longer going to be working? So it creates an interesting issue. Likewise, Down syndrome. Almost everyone with Down syndrome goes on to develop Alzheimer's by the time they're in their 50s and 60s. And I can explain that later. The good news for everyone in this room is that the better educated you are, the lower your chances are of developing Alzheimer's and other forms of dementias. So stay cognitively engaged, continue to learn throughout your entire life. Likewise, make sure you do what your mom told you to do. Eat healthy, don't smoke, get exercise. All of those are found to be useful for your brain, and make sure you are not stressed out. Now, why is age such a significant risk factor? And you could see the impact that age has on this slide. It turns out that 1 out of every 20 people over the age of 65 has Alzheimer's disease, and that number doubles every 5 years thereafter. So 1 in 20 over the age of 65, 1 in 10 over 70, 1 in 5 over 75, and 1 out of every 2 to 3 people over the age of 80 to 85 suffers from just Alzheimer's disease dementia. And so you could see that as we live longer, this problem is beginning to manifest. You should be very happy and proud to know that UCI is home to one of the NIH's Centers of Excellence. These were created by Congress in 1984. The Congressional Centers of Excellence were, the first one were the Alzheimer's Centers, and there were 5 that were part of the original Centers of Excellence, and UCI was part of that original 5, and we have been continuously funded ever since. They are found only at major medical institutions across the United States. You could see it's grown considerably from the original 5. There are now 31 across the network. Our goal is to translate advances in discoveries about dementia and Alzheimer's so that we can improve diagnosis and improve the treatment and care for these individuals. And we're part of a network, and even though each center has its own area of emphasis, we all contribute data and other approaches and research ideas to the network so we can all benefit. The NIH describes these as a national treasure. And it's something that I think all of us should be very proud of, that we have this in our own backyard here. So I want to switch a little bit to our foundational vision, which is related to MindBody World, and I alluded to this earlier. The idea is that for most of us, to have a healthy mind, we need to have a healthy body. To have a healthy body, you need to have a healthy world. And I really want everyone to recognize that life is interconnected. None of us want to live in a world where the water is toxic, the air is polluted. We recognize that we're not going to thrive under those situations. And so I think we all have a role in this room to help educate our members of our society, particularly at a time when science is coming under such attack like it never has before in its history. So you heard a great example from Marcelo about the role of addiction. And so that was a great example of mine. I just want to relay one related to autism. So from some of the research, for example, described by Professor Michael Leon in neurobiology and behavior. And he sought out to ask a very interesting question, which was, can environmental enrichment improve the symptoms in children on autism with autism spectrum disorder? And what he would do is provide standard care plus environmental enrichment, tactile stimulation, and also olfactory cues. And what he found was that 41% of the children given this had a marked improvement in their symptoms compared to 7% with only standard care alone. After 6 months, about 21%, more than one out of every 5 of the children were no longer diagnosed with classical autism versus 0% who just received the standard care alone. And this led to improvements in their IQ and other cognitive domains. And so it's a nice example of how you could solve real-world problems through discovery, showing that environmental enrichment can play a big role in helping individuals with this issue. What about some body issues? Well, we know that cancer is a significant problem in our society today. And so Professor Amy Ettinger in the Department of Neurobiology, in the Department of Developmental and Cell Biology, was asking a very simple question. Is there a way that we could selectively kill or starve cancer cells? And so she went to yeast, which is responsible for making bread and wine and beer, and wanted to know whether or not there were molecules that were in there that could be transformed into cancer drugs. And so she was able to identify some of these molecules that are able to interfere with the ability of these cancer cells to eat. And cancer cells grow very aggressively. That means they require a lot of energy. So if you starve them of their food supply, their energy requirement, they die. And when you combine that with chemo and radiation therapy, it works much better than if you do not provide this starvation method. And so this may be a great way to start thinking about treating cancer in the future. And she is trying to develop a company that revolves around this important work. Now, what other issues related to the body can we talk about? Well, Professor James Hicks, who's also the chair of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, has been really interested on the impact of sports injuries, particularly to the head. And when we think of head injuries, we generally think of sports like football and hockey. We don't normally think of water polo. And he started getting interested in water polo because his sons played this sport, and he noticed that, it seems to be a lot more violent than people may give it credit to. And so he started developing very innovative tools to address this and found out that, yes, water polo players do sustain head injury. And it turns out that it didn't matter if you were practicing or in an actual game, that about 30% of, 37% of these head impacts, were sustained by individuals who were playing in these offensive type roles. And so it allows us to develop technology now to try to mitigate the head injury that these young individuals are playing, thinking that they're doing something that's great for their minds and their bodies, but that could have long-term detrimental consequences. Now in the world, this is one of my favorite slides. One of our newly recruited faculty, Professor Jolie Lamb, an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, has been studying coral reefs. And it turns out that coral reefs are dying at an alarming rate. The Great Barrier Reef off of the coast of Australia that is visible from the moon is dying. And it's dying because the oceans are warming up, the water temperature is getting warmer, the oceans are becoming more acidic, there's less oxygen, and many more toxics there. And so one of the things that she found out, that in the Pacific Ocean, there are over 11 billion pieces of plastic atop some coral reefs. And that number is projected to grow. Now, one of the things I was surprised to find out was that these plastics can actually sink. Because when you think of plastics, you think of them as being very buoyant. Well, it turns out that when the plastics become encrusted with bacteria and viruses and fungi, they start to sink. And now they're able to transmit those infectious particles to nearby coral reef. And so she was the first to discover that ordinary plastic trash can serve essentially as a Trojan horse to infect coral reefs. And I think all of us in this room could appreciate that if the coral reefs die, it's not long before the fisheries go. And once that happens, it's not long after that human life, I think, will cease to exist as well. So it's absolutely critical that we conduct research to figure out how to save as many of the coral reefs as we possibly can. Lastly, I think this is a great example of how all of this is interconnected, and this is work from Professor Mike Yase in my department in neurobiology and behavior, and he was interested in studying, why memory declines as we get older and what can we do about it. And one of the things that he discovered, which received worldwide attention, was that light exercise, just walking 10 minutes a day, can improve your memory. And so everyone was like, woohoo, right? No one wants to go to the gym and work out and do cardio and all that other stuff, but everyone can walk 10 minutes a day. And so light exercise is able to improve communication in the brain among different regions that are involved in learning and memory, and it can slow down your cognitive decline. That's remarkable. So that means individuals who are suffering from dementia, their rate of progression can be diminished by walking, can be further diminished by walking with someone and talking and communicating and being stimulated cognitively as well as physically. And so I think this is a great example of how interconnected life is, and that what's good in this case for your body ends up being beneficial for your brain and your mind. So with that, I'd like to leave you with another quote that I like immensely from Carl Sagan, who says, "We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology." And I think that's why it's so exciting for us to be able to educate so many students about the value of the life sciences. And so with that, I will stop and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
You mentioned how the School of Biological Sciences encourages collaboration What do you do to encourage collaboration, say, within the engineering and biological sciences or in the information sciences, computer sciences and that?
So great question. So the question was, what do we as a school do to promote interactions with other schools like engineering, medicine, and there are many things that we do. So for example, we have faculty that have joint appointments in other schools. We have joint retreats to discuss timely research interests that overlap. The deans of various schools will put in significant sums of money to try to stimulate pilot grants, to stimulate new research into unknown areas. So we share students, we do a lot of activities because science is becoming more transdisciplinary these days and much more collaborative than what it used to be. So great question.
Thank you, Dean, for the lecture. I have a question about Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
Do you believe that sleep has a direct relationship to the development of Alzheimer's disease? The quality of sleep or the quantity of sleep?
Great question. And that has been perhaps one of the most exciting areas of Alzheimer's research over the last 5 to 7 years. And yes, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that sleep and quality of sleep is absolutely critical. And so the question is, why does sleep matter for your brain? And I try to use this example where if many of you live in communities where street sweepers come by on a weekly basis to clean up all the debris off of the street, one of the requirements that they always have is that you move your cars and so that the streets are clear so the street sweepers could come and clean up all the debris as easily as possible. And I think the same reason underlies why we sleep. You know, your brain, our brains, you know, are about 2% of our body's mass. But yet they're a very selfish organ from an energy point of view. Essentially, 1/5 of all the energy that our body requires goes to maintain our brain. And so it's a very energy selfish organ. And as a result, when you consume that much energy, you create a lot of toxic byproducts that eventually you need to get rid of. And I think sleep is our body's mechanism to get rid of those toxic byproducts when you don't have a lot of distracting noise going on from being cognitively active. So much the same way that you don't want cars on the street when your street sweeper walks by, I think your brain wants you to sleep so it could effectively clear away a lot of the toxic products that accumulate. And so there's a lot of evidence that people that have disrupted sleep, who don't sleep efficiently, are at a higher incidence of developing Alzheimer's disease. Great question.
Hello, Dean. Thank you again for your time today. You had mentioned that exercise is one of the factors that could help improve someone not getting Alzheimer's. Other than exercise, what would you say are some of the other leading factors that might help somebody not get symptoms or be diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's specifically?
Yeah, the first is don't age. But there are other aspects as well. Staying cognitively engaged seems to be absolutely critical. So for example, with exercise, if you exercise 10 minutes, 20 minutes is better. If you exercise 20 minutes, 40 minutes is better. And that seems to be more or less the plateau that you get. There doesn't seem to be any benefit to exercising more than, say 2 hours, for example. That's not true for being cognitively stimulated. So if you challenge your brain and you do it for a half hour, an hour is better. If you do it for an hour, 2 hours better. You do it 2 hours, 4 hours better. So there's seems to be some benefit to being cognitively engaged. Now the key thing there is that you really want to challenge yourself. And so reading People magazine does not count as being cognitively engaged. But seriously, another question that we always get is, well, what about if I do Sudoku and crossword puzzles? The problem is that when you do things like Sudoku, you eventually learn the strategies. And so if all you do is Sudoku, you lose the cognitive ability, the protective ability, and all you do is become better at doing Sudoku puzzles. So there are other things that you can do as well. One is do not get diabetes. Many people now refer to Alzheimer's as the new type 3 diabetes. Do not become obese. Watch what you eat. There's a lot of evidence that the Mediterranean diet that's enriched in seafood, so individuals who consume at least one serving of fish per week cut their risk of dementia by 50%. Which is pretty amazing. If you have a piece of salmon just once a week, you lower your risk by 50%. Eating green leafy vegetables, even moderate alcohol consumption, 1 or 2 glasses of any type of alcohol may be beneficial. And I think this illustrates why studying these kind of issues in humans is so challenging, because is it something in the alcohol that's beneficial for your brain, or is it that most people who consume 1 or 2 glasses do it in a social setting where they're being cognitively engaged, and so your stress levels are being reduced, and so it just reflects, I think, some of the challenges that you see there. But sleep is another one to reduce your risk, not smoking, for example. So there are a number of things that we can do to lower our risk. Now, none of them are guaranteed to have an 100% effect. So you could be a marathon runner your whole life and you still may develop dementia at some point, but you might have developed it 5 years sooner if you didn't do those activities when you were younger. So maintaining a high quality of life, I think, is absolutely critical.
Hi, thank you so much for your time, Dean.
My pleasure.
Earlier you showed a slide with some statistics on how by 2050, the population will be at a significantly greater risk of developing dementia. Is that data from folks that we've studied in the United States? Is that different internationally? Do you think the numbers are the same for our country versus others, and why do you think that is?
Also a very wonderful question. The problem is actually more acute in certain countries than it is in the United States right now. So for example, in Japan, they're in the midst of this aging crisis. It turns out that 1/3 of the population of Japan is over the age of 65. And it turns out that the same issue is true in many of the developed countries in Western Europe. Most of the countries there actually have a negative birth rate. There are more people dying than are being born. And people jokingly say that the reason for this issue is that the best birth control in the world is capitalism. And that's why we're seeing in these very rich countries that the birth rate is going down. And it goes down at a time when longevity is going up. And all of our societies are based on a social and economic principle of a pyramid, that we have lots of young people and fewer old people. And what we're seeing is that pyramid is now being inverted. And that's going to create significant challenges as we have a larger aging population to be cared for by a younger economic base. But certain countries, it's actually much more acute than what it is here in the United States. But the general age-related statistics that I showed you seems to hold true in every ethnic group, every nationality, 1 out of every 20 people over 65 and doubling every 5 years thereafter. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.